Iga Swiatek, Jessica Pegula, Aryna Sabalenka. Those three names are not scattered randomly across the US Open draw this year. They are sitting directly on the path of Alex Eala. Most people glance at a draw sheet and see a list of names. They see seeds and numbers and move on. What they do not see is the actual shape of the danger. They do not see how one path through a Grand Slam can be a walk in the park, while another path, a path like the one Eala has been handed, looks like something out of a horror movie where the monsters just keep getting bigger the deeper you go. So, here is the claim, and I want you to sit with it for a second before we go any further. This is not just a tough draw. This might be one of the most dangerous, most loaded paths anyone has to survive at this entire tournament. Three of the biggest names in women's tennis are not just present in the field, they are potentially standing directly in front of Alex Eala at different points on her way through this event. A former world number one. A player who has been to the US Open final. A woman who has spent significant time as the best player on the planet. That is not a coincidence of seeding. That is a gauntlet. And almost nobody talking about this draw is actually mapping it out properly. They are naming the players. They are not explaining what each one of them actually represents, why each round carries its own unique kind of danger, and what it would genuinely take for Eala to make it through even one of these matchups, let alone all three. That is exactly what we are doing right now. We are going to walk through this draw round by round. We are going to identify exactly where the real threats are hiding, including the ones that do not have a famous name attached to them but might be just as dangerous as the big three. And we are going to figure out what actually determines whether Eala survives each stage of this path or gets swallowed by it. But before we can talk about any of these monsters by name, we need to understand something most casual fans completely overlook. The draw itself is not just a formality. It might be the single biggest factor standing between Eala and a deep run at this tournament, bigger than her ranking, bigger than her recent form, bigger than almost anything else we could talk about. Here is something most casual fans never think about, and once you understand it, this entire draw is going to look completely different to you. At a Grand Slam, your ranking gets you into the tournament. It does not decide how your tournament actually goes. What decides that is the draw. Who you get placed next to, which quarter of the bracket you land in, and which seeded players are sitting 2 or 3 rounds ahead of you before you have even played your first match. Think of the draw like a map of a dangerous city. Some players get dropped into a quiet neighborhood. Easy streets, low seeds, a soft run for at least the first week. Other players get dropped right into the part of the map where all the danger is clustered together. Same tournament, same rules, completely different level of difficulty, and it all comes down to where your name landed on that sheet before a single ball was hit. Eala did not land in the quiet neighborhood. She landed in one of the most loaded sections of the entire women's draw, a section where, if the seeds hold even close to form, she is not just facing one dangerous opponent, she is facing a potential sequence of them, each one bigger than the last, stacked on top of each other like a gauntlet designed to test every single part of her game. Now let's talk about where she stands heading into this. Eala comes into this tournament with real momentum behind her name. She has already beaten a former top 3 player, not once, but twice this season. She has climbed into ranking territory that would have sounded unrealistic for her just a year ago. She is no longer the surprise underdog nobody saw coming. She is a player opponents now specifically prepare for, which tells you everything about how far she has already come. But momentum and ranking only tell you what she has done so far. They do not tell you what stands in front of her. If you have been enjoying breaking down what a draw actually means instead of just glancing at a bracket and moving on, this is exactly the kind of tennis analysis worth sticking around for. Drop a comment with which of these 3 names scares you the most for Eala, because I guarantee your answer is going to change by the end of this video. Because when you actually look at the first layer of this draw, the part everyone assumes is the easy part, you start to realize the danger here does not begin with Swiatek, Pegula, or Sabalenka. It begins much earlier than that. Let's start where everyone assumes the safe part of the draw is, because that is exactly where the first trap is hiding. Round 1 and Round 2 are supposed to be the calm before the storm. Lower-ranked opponents. Names casual fans do not recognize. The part of the tournament where a player, like Eala, is supposed to get her rhythm going before the real challenges begin. Except, that is not actually how dangerous draws work. Early round opponents in a section this loaded are rarely just filler. Tournament seeding tends to cluster certain playing styles together, and in Eala's section, at least one potential early opponent plays a game built specifically to frustrate someone like her. A grinder. A player who does not care about hitting winners, who wants to turn every single point into a long, physical argument, who wins by making her opponent hit one more ball than they want to, and then one more. After that. That style is dangerous precisely because it does not look dangerous on paper. No big ranking, no highlight reel. Just a player whose entire game plan is to slow everything down and make a more talented opponent uncomfortable for 3 sets straight. Here is the mini question worth sitting with. If Eala's biggest threat in Round 1 is not talent but tempo, is she actually ready to win an ugly, grinding match against someone with nothing to lose? Now layer in the second piece of this puzzle. Recent matches Eala has played against exactly this kind of opponent have not always gone smoothly. There have been stretches this season where she has looked completely in control against flashy, aggressive players and then looked strangely uncomfortable against someone simply pushing the ball back with discipline and patience. That is not a coincidence. That is a specific gap in her game that patient opponents have started to notice and exploit. So here is question number 2. If that gap is real, and if opponents are already scouting for it, what happens when she runs into exactly that style in Round 1 of a Grand Slam, with everything on the line and almost no room for error? And then there is the third layer, the one that turns this from a minor concern into something much bigger. Even if Eala solves that first test, the section does not get easier. It gets more physically demanding. Longer matches early in a tournament mean less recovery time before the real gauntlet begins. A 3-set battle in Round 1 against a grinder is not just a single hurdle. It is a toll. It drains time, energy, and mental focus that she is going to desperately need 2 or 3 rounds later when the real monsters of this draw start to appear. So picture this: a tough, unglamorous Round 1 match that drags into a third set. A Round 2 opponent who has been watching and adjusting. And somewhere past that, the shadow of a former world number 1 waiting in the exact same section. Put those 3 layers together, and the early rounds stop looking like a formality. They start looking like a test disguised as a warm-up, a test that could quietly decide whether Eala even has anything left in the tank by the time she reaches the part of this draw everyone actually came here to talk about. Because right now, on paper, this section looks unforgiving from the very first match to the very last. There does not seem to be an easy version of this path. Every single round appears to demand something more difficult than the one before it. But there is one part of this we have not looked at yet, one angle that changes how you should be reading this entire draw. Here is the piece almost nobody talking about this draw has actually stopped to consider. We have been looking at this entire path as a straight line of escalating danger. Round 1, a little dangerous. Then the big 3, extremely dangerous. Everyone assumes difficulty only moves in one direction, upward, match after match, until it either breaks a player or crowns her. That assumption is wrong, and once you see why, the entire shape of this draw flips in your head. A loaded section like this does not just threaten Eala. It threatens everyone standing between her and the players everyone is actually talking about. Swiatek, Pegula, Sabalenka. They are not walking through a quiet, empty hallway to get to their own matches with Eala. They are walking through the exact same minefield she is. Here is the analogy that makes this click instantly. Think of this section of the draw like a mountain pass where an avalanche has just come through. Everybody assumes the biggest names at the top of the mountain are untouchable, that they will simply arrive at the top no matter what happens below them. But an avalanche does not check rankings before it hits. It takes out whoever is standing in its path, seed or no seed. That means every single round in this section carries a real chance of chaos before Eala ever gets anywhere near a top name. Seeds get upset in brutal draws like this one more often than casual fans expect because a section this loaded forces players into physically and mentally exhausting matches long before the big showdown everyone circled on their calendar. Now, connect that directly to Eala. If one of those grinding, tricky early opponents we just talked about ends up facing a seeded player instead of her, that seed does not walk into their next match fresh. They walk in tired. They walk in having already spent energy surviving exactly the kind of trap Eala might face herself. A 3-set battle early in a Grand Slam does not just cost the loser, it costs the winner too, in ways that show up 2 rounds later when legs are heavier and focus is thinner. Here is the reframe. This brutal section is not just a threat to Eala, it is a threat to everyone in it, including the very names that make this draw look terrifying on paper. So the real question is not simply can Eala survive Swiatek or Pegula or Sabalenka in a vacuum. The real question is what condition will that player actually be in by the time she reaches Eala? Because a slightly worn-down version of a former world number 1 is a completely different opponent than a fresh, rested one. I want to know what you think about this before we go any further. If you had to guess which of these 3 big names is most likely to be worn down or even upset before facing Eala, drop that name in the comments right now, because we are about to look at exactly what the numbers say about that. Because a reframe like this only matters if the evidence actually backs it up. It is easy to say a draw is chaotic. It is much harder to prove that the chaos genuinely favors the player everyone has already written off as the underdog. That is exactly where we are headed next. Let's put this theory to the test with the numbers, because a good theory means nothing without proof behind it. Start with how often a section this densely loaded actually produces upsets before the big names collide. Look across recent Grand Slam history, and you find the same pattern again and again. When multiple top 10 players get grouped into the same quarter or the same third of a draw, the road to that eventual showdown is rarely clean. Seeds fall. Early rounds turn into 3-set battles nobody expected. The players everyone circled on their bracket sheet do not always arrive intact. That is not a hopeful assumption. That is a repeating pattern across major tournaments, and Eala's section has all the ingredients that produce exactly this kind of chaos. Here is the second piece of evidence, and this one is about Eala specifically, not just draw theory in general. Look at how she has performed against the exact profile of a seeded, aggressive ball striker this season, the kind of game Swiatek, Pegula, and Sabalenka all bring in different ways. Her recent results against that style are far more competitive than her results against grinders and pushers. She thrives on pace. She uses an opponent's power against them. Against players who hit hard and take risks, she has repeatedly shown she can hang, and in some cases completely take over a match, which is exactly what happened against a former top 3 player, not once, but twice this season. That detail matters enormously here because 2 of the 3 biggest names in this section, Swiatek and Sabalenka, are exactly the kind of high-pace, high-risk players Eala has already proven she can match up well against. Now the third piece, the one that ties this whole picture together. Go back to those 2 wins over a former top 3 opponent. That was not a fluke result against a tired veteran. That was proof, real match proof, that Eala does not freeze in front of a famous name. She does not shrink on a big stage. She has already stood across the net from someone with a bigger resume than her and found a way to win twice, which is more career-defining evidence than most players her age will ever have. Put all 3 pieces together, a section of the draw statistically likely to produce chaos before the big collisions happen. A playing style from Eala that matches up well against exactly the kind of power players she is most likely to face deep in this section. and a proven history of performing, not panicking, against opponents with far bigger reputations. That is not a guarantee. Nothing in tennis is ever a guarantee, but it completely changes the emotional read on this draw. This was never simply an impossible gauntlet designed to end her tournament early. It might actually be one of the more favorable versions of a difficult draw that a player with her specific game could have been handed. And here is one detail almost nobody is talking about yet, the kind of thing that only shows up if you dig deep into the schedule and surface notes for this tournament. The court conditions and rest days lining up around this section slightly favor a player who wants long baseline exchanges with real pace on the ball, exactly the conditions where Eala's game has looked its most dangerous all season. So the question is no longer simply how scary is this draw. The real question is, what does Eala's tournament actually look like if even one or two of these pieces break in her favor, and where does that leave her when we start talking about the biggest names on this path? So let's go back to where we started. Swiatek, Pegula, Sabalenka. Three names sitting on the same path as Alex Eala at this year's US Open. The honest answer is this draw is exactly as loaded as it looks. There is no version of this section that qualifies as easy. But loaded does not mean hopeless, and dangerous does not mean impossible. What we have actually found is a path that punishes everyone standing in it, not just Eala, and a player whose game happens to match up well against the exact kind of power, tennis that defines the biggest names in her way. That is the real story here. Not a young player thrown into a section built to end her tournament early, but a player whose specific skill set lines up with the specific dangers sitting in front of her, at a moment when she has already proven twice this season that big names do not scare her. So what does this actually mean going forward? It means the next few weeks are not just about whether Eala can survive a tough draw. They are about whether this is the point tournament where everything we have been talking about finally clicks into place at the biggest stage tennis has to offer. A grinder tested in round one, a field worn down by its own difficulty, and a player built for exactly the kind of collision waiting for her deeper in the bracket. We still do not know which of these three giants she is most likely to actually face. We do not know which one of them survives their own side of this chaos long enough to get there. That question is bigger than anything we can answer in one video, and it deserves its own breakdown. So here is where we leave it. Out of Swiatek, Pegula, and Sabalenka, one of them represents the single biggest threat to Eala's run this tournament, and the reasons why are more specific and more surprising than you would expect. We are going to break down exactly who that is and exactly what it would take for Eala to get past them in the next video. If you want to be there the moment we answer that question, subscribe now, because this story is only getting started.